Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a rather special evening, it seems, viewing what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. And this looks like having quite a profound effect on policy concerning the subject of this lecture function. So anyway, it's my privilege as to be chairman of the Australian Environment Foundation, and on behalf of the AF and my fellow directors, I would like to welcome you very warmly to this inaugural Robert Carter commemorative lecture, and to thank you very much for coming, in some cases from quite a long way away. And the lecture will be given by Professor Tim Ball. I would like to extend a particular welcome to Bob and Ann Carter's son, Jeremy. Now, among Bob's many other attainments, Bob was a director of the AEF, and Bob's deep knowledge, wise judgment, and never-failing good humour are very, very sorely missed by his director colleagues. Now, the Australian Environment Foundation is dedicated to assessing environmental issues based on a rigorous analysis of the scientific and historical evidence as opposed to ideology. Where that assessment indicates a problem, the solution should be informed by sound economics, weighing the costs against the benefits for the benefit of the community as a whole, and with a respect for existing property rights. And that's one of the big challenges of environmental legislation. Property rights are flouted. To AEF, human beings are part of the environment and not aliens to it. Now, we're very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Tim Ball as the inaugural Robert Carter commemorative lecturer. Alan Moran, my fellow director, will start proceedings by paying tribute to Bob Carter and then introducing Tim Ball. After Tim's lecture, there will be the opportunity for comment, discussion and questions. And at the end of proceedings, John Spooner, co-author with Bob Carter of that really splendid book, Taxing Air, Facts and Fallacies About Climate Change, will move a vote of thanks to Tim Ball. So our proceedings will be chaired by Alan Moran, whom I now invite to introduce Tim Ball.
Thanks very much, Tom. It was not much longer, a year ago, when it was my privilege to offer introductory remarks about Bob Carter at a Heartland conference on climate change in Washington, where he was awarded a special lifelong award for achievement. Nobody present at that conference thought that the address would have become a valedictory. Bob was actually doing some of his best work throughout his life there in his later years. And indeed, he became a very prominent participant in the climate change debate. And it was an issue that really only came to him, or he came to, in the last decade or so of his life. And he joined a hardy band of climate realists, one of whom we're going to hear from tonight, who attended the notorious Paris Climate Change Conference in December of last year, only a month or so before his death. And he was a star in the film Climate Hustle that was launched at that conference in December. Like his nemesis, Tim Flannery, Bob Carter started life as a paleontologist. But unlike Professor Flannery, Bob would never surrender his scientific discipline that was based on reviews, on research, and empirical testing of hypotheses. And in doing so, he willingly chose to sacrifice the funding that governments offer to those willing to distort science and promote the catastrophic global warming myth. That remuneration-denying position was something the enemies of science within the warmister group of people, community, could never understand. And as he became more prominent, they trawled through his connections, trying to find what funding sources of big oil, big coal, or big whatever that they always imagine, must motivate their enemies because, of course, they themselves are motivated by big government spending and big renewable industry spending. But all they could find in funding from Bob was a stipend of a mere $1,600 per month paid by the Heartland Foundation for his assiduous research and careful writing and organising his work as the lead author of the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, a piece of work that went into many, many hundreds of pages. The report was called Climate Change Revisited. Of course, such a sum would be chicken feed to all those lapping the Warminster allocated taxation funds in the US, Australia, and the UK. But actually, what Heartland didn't know when they paid this fairly modest stipend is that Bob's dedication to science meant he'd have done it for nothing. Just as he crisscrossed Australia, addressing any audience that he could find, promoting the true story of climate and its very limited susceptibility to human influence. And I know from personal experience how he would go out of his way to offer comfort and support to those of his colleagues and friends who faced particular difficulties. With these sorts of attributes, Bob was the first person to whom I turned when preparing the anthology Climate Change: The Facts, that thanks to Mark Stein later became an Amazon bestseller. Pulling together a dozen or a score of experts, most of them with global reputations and some with well-deserved egos, into a readable publication required a lot of tact. And I owe much to Bob in helping select the different contributors and smoothing ruffled feathers when their contributions were modified to make the piece, or the book, more readable. But aside from these publications, Bob himself authored two eminently readable books on the science of climate change, as well as dozens of scientific articles on particular aspects of it. And two of these, two co-authors of his last book, as Tom has mentioned, Bill Kinnaman and John Sponer, are here with us this evening. That last book was Taxing Air, Facts and Fallacies About Climate Change. A major part of the genial nature of Bob Carter was owed to his family life, and in particular his wife Anne, who was an art specialist, must have helped convert the scientific boffin into a well-rounded and personable character whose company we all enjoyed. Like Bob, and indeed me, our guest speaker, Professor Tim Ball, was actually born in the old art and migrated to one of the Dominions, where most of his work was undertaken. Like Bob, Tim has also made the transition to climate change from another discipline, in Tim's case, geography. He became a professor at Winnipeg University in 1988. Never one to avoid a fight, like Mark Stein, he's courted and accepted the ire of the most litigious of scientific alarmists, the notorious Michael Mann, inventor of the now discredited hockey stick temperature trend. Most of us, of course, are quite familiar with this, but his key depictions are of global temperature increases, which were used by the Al Gores and the IPCCs of this world, and managed to airbrush from history the medieval cooling, and thus purported to show that climate temperatures had risen over the past 50 years or so. Tim has undertaken serious detailed studies of Canada's climate, which demonstrates none of the catastrophic trends so loved by alarmist scientists, and he was highly instrumental in exploding the myth of the disappearance of that emblem of global disaster, and of course for the Australians, Bundaberg rum, that is the polar bear. Tim's been a contester in the climate scare since the beginning in the 1990s, and he's written scores of articles and delivered hundreds, I think 600 in the past 4 or 5 years, of addresses on the subject. His most recent book was A Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science, the theme of which is self-explanatory, and he's done some sterling work, like our own Jennifer Marahasi, in demonstrating how data sets have been changed to give these false appearances of more warming than has been the case by revisions of the historical record. So I'd like to invite Tim to offer the Australian Environment Foundation inaugural lecture on Bob Carter. Thanks, Tim.
Sorry, we have a gentleman with a cochlear implant, and he's got a microphone, so I want to make sure he hears everything. Thank you. I didn't know where to start once I was asked to speak at this inaugural event for Bob Carter. I was so pleased to get a wonderful email from his wife, Anne, and congratulating me, and then from his son as well, who I'm pleased to be here. One of the things that Bob and I would always agree on was, because we both agreed that we had to keep going. You know, we had to keep telling everybody what was going on, the corruption. And so often you get to a point where you say, well, what's the point? Nobody's listening, the media's against you and everything else. The one thing Bob and I always agreed on was that we wanted to make sure that no politician could ever say they weren't told. That was the driving force of what we did. And the other thing I liked about Bob was we agreed from the start that we would disagree, but we wouldn't be disagreeable, right? And that was a very important part of some of the very rigorous debates we had. It's very difficult to oppose even within your, or be contrary even in your own discipline, but to do it in another discipline and then incur the wrath of the people in your area is really problematic. And I don't know, some of you know how nasty the politics can be in academia. I think it was C.P. Snow that said it's because they've got nothing else to do. And certainly, and I can tell you one of the reasons I took retirement was because I said there was so much scar tissue on my back, there was nowhere to put a knife anymore. So I had to get out. But Bob and I, at the Heartland conferences, we were on the panels together, but we were also in endless discussions. Tom Harris at the International Climate Science Coalition, sorry. And so it was wonderful. And but the other thing that concerned us was not only the damage done to climate science and the loss of credibility, but the loss of credibility of science across the board. And you're seeing more and more stories about that in the media. And Bob and I were very much of an agreement that the funding was so much of that, that people would do anything for the money to get the funding. And just to make a point of that Bob and I talked about quite often, because we both saw it happen. About the 1960s and 70s, universities, there was cutback of funding to universities in many countries in the world because the economic cutback. And the universities, with quite reasonable arguments, said, hey, you're getting research funding, we're providing you with office space and heat and light, so we're going to take a portion off the top of that research funding. And it got to 35, 40%. What that did, of course, was it made those that brought in large amounts of research funding more valuable than the people that were just trying to do good research and good science. And it distorted the whole academic world. And it went from publish or perish to bring in the money or perish. That really is what happened. And it's very much a part of what's going on today. So I say I'm very, very grateful to be here. I'd like to think that Bob would be pleased that I was the first one chosen. And I certainly hope I don't let him down this evening. But I also want to, there's so much going on with the election of Trump, and I'll fill you in on some, because I've got some inside stories on that particular event. If we can get the right, here we go. Two things I'll bring you up to date on. One is my lawsuits, because, and Bob and I talked about this a great deal, it isn't just that you are stabbing at the academic community or opposing the academic community, but you're also, because the science has become so political, you're a political threat. I'm not that great a scientist or great a guy, but I had a combination of things that was particularly problematic. The one was they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. They tried in various ways. You can read this Smog blog and all that stuff, but they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. The second thing is that the good Lord gave me an ability to talk to people about complex ideas in a way they could understand. And just to give you an idea, for 25 years, I taught a science credit course for art students. So I developed that ability to help them understand the science. And by the way, I fought all my career to make a history of science course compulsory for all students in high school. I think it should be a mandatory thing. But anyway, so I had that ability to talk. That, of course, made me a great threat. And so the first lawsuit I got was Gordon McBean, who'd been the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment Canada and chaired the founding meeting of the IPCC in Villach, Austria in 1985. And I wrote an article about his role in all of this. And within a few hours, I had a lawsuit. My wife and I decided, we looked at it and said, no, we can't afford to fight this. And of course, that's the problem with it, is the costs involved. And as you know, people are afraid of even getting a lawyer's letter because that's going to cost you some money. And I should, just a little aside here, I had a solicitor friend in England who had a standard letter that said, "Dear sir, such and such has come to our attention. If it isn't dealt with immediately, we will do things that will astonish you." I love that kind of invective. But anyway, we decided that we couldn't afford to fight the lawsuit, so I withdrew the article, and that was fine. And by the way, when these people bring lawsuits against you, they don't just do it against you, they do it against the publication that's put your work out. So, of course, you're now in conflict with your publisher as well, and that adds to the jeopardy. Anyway, the second lawsuit was, I made some comments because I had a long interview with Andrew Weaver. Now, for those of you who don't know, Andrew Weaver was the lead author on the computer model chapters in the IPCC, and he was involved in 4 of the IPCC reports. And I interviewed him in 1996 because, at his request. And I said to him after 20 minutes, "You don't know much about climate," which seemed to annoy him somehow. I don't know. But of course, he was one of the problems we've got in climate science. He was a computer modeler. He was a mathematician who decided that climate models would bring him lots of research funds, and therefore he became involved in it. So I got the lawsuit there. And by the way, all the lawsuits are from the same lawyer. They're all from the same lawyer. And I'll tell you how pervasive this is. When I went to the first Heartland Conference in New York, and I was a keynote with Fred Singer, which was a great honor. And Fred said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, okay, but I got a lawsuit." And he said, "Oh, McConkie." I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "He sued all of us." He sued all of us. And so anyway, I got that lawsuit. I then went to Winnipeg, Canada, and gave a public discussion on man's hockey stick. And by the way, there's laws in hockey. You cannot play with a broken stick. Right? But man still seems to be able to do it. But I gave a talk about it. And then afterwards, I was interviewed. And the interviewer said, "Well, what do you think about Michael Mann?" And I, with my usual flippancy, said, "He's at Penn State, but he should be at State Penn." and 12 hours later, I had another lawsuit. And here's the bizarre thing about it, the extent to which these people will go to track you down. So that was a speech I gave, and there was a lawsuit was brought by an American living in Pennsylvania, and the speech was made in Manitoba, Canada, and the lawsuit was filed in British Columbia, Canada. So you want to see how far they'll go to find a court that will entertain this kind of, and the word for it, by the way, is a SLAP lawsuit. That's an acronym for a strategic lawsuit against public participation. The law people are very concerned about them because, of course, they're undermining the whole concept of law. Law is supposed to defend, and here you're using the law to punish people. I can tell you, so far, I'm going to court February 20th, and one of the things that's changed about it was my lawyer initially he was on the alarmist side, okay, let's put it that way. But gradually, as he got to read all the material, like so many people do, when they finally look at what's going on, they suddenly say, "Hey, this is a problem." Our initial defense was going to be just to prove that the medieval warm period did exist. And just say that Michael Mann therefore lied about it or corrected the graph to get rid of it. And I'll do a little bit of that here. But just about 2 months ago, the lawyer said no. No. He said, there's a much bigger opportunity here. And I want to explain something to you. Courts will not entertain scientific disputes. Because what they say is it's your paper against my paper, and we're not qualified to make that kind of judgment. Okay? Which is reasonable, very reasonable. But what we have here, of course, is it's my paper against your corrupted paper. And why did you corrupt it? How did you corrupt it? And then the question becomes, did you do it deliberately or did you do it through ignorance? For me, either way, it's a problem. If you're incompetent, you're wrong. And if you did it illegally, that's equally wrong. So this is what's going on. So my lawyer finally said to me, look, Mr. Mann's giving us a courtroom. We've got 30 days. He said, why don't we put the whole of climate science on trial? Right? Let's get all of these. And last night in Canberra, we were with Tony Heller, and Tony was showing how they altered the data and adjusted the data. I knew that had been going on for 20 years, but Tony has the expertise to identify it. And of course, Tony showed this to the audience first, and then I was able to come out and say, okay, ask yourself, why would scientists alter data? Why would governments change records? There really is only one answer. And so the question, of course, then becomes motive. What's the motive? So my speech was towards the motive, and that's going to be a part of my theme tonight. So that's a sort of a background on what's going on with the lawsuit. By the way, I can tell you, and this is another intimidating factor, my legal bills so far are $1.1 million. Okay? Takes my breath away. Anyway, and I should tell you, people have been incredibly generous. And the thing that pleased me most, the number of people that sent money and said in their attachment, we don't totally agree with you, but God damn it, you got the right to say it. Okay? Sorry, I get choked up over this. But that was a very encouraging part of what's going on here. I'm probably looking at 2.5 million by the time it's all over. So it gives you an idea of how people would just say, no, I'm not going to fight it. But as I said, my wife and I sat down after our first lawsuit. We just said, no, we're not going to be bullied anymore. No more. Anyway, let's get around to more pleasant things. I predicted that Trump was going to win. And there's all sorts of misconceptions. In fact, coming from the airport, the cab driver was displaying the degree to which the American mainstream media distorted the whole picture for the world. It is frightening. It is frightening the extent to which they did it. Trump is a very well-read man, reads voraciously, and yet they put out the idea that he was a blundering idiot. He's a graduate MBA, Wharton Business School, one of the best in the US, okay? And his successes, yes, he's had failures, but anybody in business, you have failures and then you go again. Trump, and one of the best lines I think that resonated with a lot of people was he said, hey, I don't need this. I could be off in my golf clubs. This is no fun for me. And he said, if I lose, to me, it'll be an enormous waste of my time and money. And he was blunt about that. But you hardly ever heard that said in the mainstream media, okay? The other thing, of course, was that you didn't see the crowds. I happened to go to one event. There were 27,000 people in the arena and another 27,000 outside that couldn't get in. So what happened there was, of course, the distortion that, oh, Trump's a bumbling idiot, and yet he made a few stupid comments. But let me tell you something else that happened with it. Because they kept analyzing Trump as if he was a politician. That was a huge mistake. And they kept seeing things that they thought would bring a politician down. It bounced right off of Trump. In fact, he turned it to his advantage. And I mentioned this story to somebody earlier, but I'll tell you. One interviewer in New York, and she was ready with her gotcha questions, right? You know how they got the gotcha questions. And she said, well, Mr. Trump, we're doing our research, and we found you gave $2.8 million to Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign. Well, for any other politician, that would have been trouble, right? Trump said, of course. He said, that's how you got to do business in this country today. You got to buy off the politicians. All right? I mean, and she just sat there absolutely dumbfounded. Right? And then, of course, now she's lost out on that one. And so then she says, where their second gotcha, well, we also found out you were doing business with the mafia in New York. He said, that's the only way to do business in New York. They're all mafia. He said, what am I going to do? And of course, so another idea or another gotcha washed away. But the other thing I want to say to you is, studying climate, and I'll bring this very, very briefly. As you know, my interest is historical climate and the impact of climate change on the human condition. And I've also taken seniors on tours of Europe many times, Pompeii 3 different times. On one tour of Pompeii, I narrowed it down to just looking at the graffiti in Pompeii. And I was blessed or cursed to go to a Catholic boarding school, so I learned how to read Latin. But one of the pieces of graffiti in Pompeii, and they were having an election, by the way, at the time of the eruption, and one of the pieces says, if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels. Right? And I thought, yeah, 2,000 years later, it's the same thing. So the question was, in my mind, are there points at which the people will get rid of the scoundrels? Because normally what they'll do is they'll just say, like Popeye, I don't know what you does, but you does it, and get on with it. They don't pay any attention. But there are times in history, and study with Toynbee and Ariel Durant and all these people about civilizations, at what point do the people say, no, that leader's got to go? There's only two things. One of them is climate, related to climate, and that is a failure of the food supply. And when you saw in Paris, in France, when you had 1787 harvest failure, price of bread went to 50% of the total income of a peasant. The next year, another harvest failure, 85% of their total income went to bread. So that winter, after a harsh winter, then they stormed the Bastille. If you think that's only historically, what happened in Egypt, which Obama turned into an Arab Spring, and said, oh, it's democracy. They don't even have democracy at the family level in most of those countries, let alone what it was food riots. And why were the food riots occurring? Well, there was harvest failure, but also the American politicians had given so much money to the corn farmers that all the corn was going into ethanol, and the price of basic foodstuffs around the world went through the roof. Those people in Egypt were rioting against Hosni Mubarak and the food prices. Of course, Obama saw that as an opportunity. He said, oh, it's democracy. He wanted to get rid of Hosni Mubarak because he wanted to put the Muslim Brotherhood in. Okay? So you see that and by the way, it's going on in Venezuela right now. Right? The same failure of the food supply and so on. So that's one. The other reason that people will get rid of leadership is if they sense that the leaders have forgotten that they only are there at the will of the people. They're only there because the people tolerate them, okay? The minute the people sense that they don't think that, they react. So when James I said, I'm a great king, and they said, yeah, sure, James, go ahead. Then he said, but it's divine right. Chop his head off. See, the minute he said, I'm not here, God put me here, not you people, gone. Louis XVI, same way, l'état c'est moi, I am the state, off with his head, okay? And that's what you're seeing right now. There's a middle-class revolution going on around the world. The Brexit was part of that because the people in London, the power people, the elites, the Camerons, they wanted to remain. They wanted the gravy train to continue. The vote outside of London, the ordinary working people, of course, were no. We're going to show you who's really the boss here. And of course, you see the people that wanted to remain showed their elitism because, well, these people will come to their senses. They'll realize, we should have a second vote. They just didn't get it, right? Well, the same thing is happening in the United States. And what Trump has done is Trump has said, I don't care about the 20% on the extreme right, elitists. I don't care about the 20% on the extreme left. I'm going for the middle class. And that's why you saw, for example, why it was so predictable that he was going to win, because the union bosses were saying, we're voting for Hillary Clinton, but all the workers were voting for Trump, right? Because Trump is saying, I'm going to get your job back from Mexico, okay? So it really was a middle-class revolution saying to the elites, hey, you think you're there because you're so smart and so clever. We're going to show you who the real bosses are, the people. So that's what went on. And there was some very interesting things that never came out. For example, Huckabee, who I thought was a wonderful American politician, his job, hired by Trump, his job was to go into the crowds at Trump rallies and ask people why they were there. And he found that 30% of the people at Trump rallies had never voted before. That is significant. And it wasn't just because they were too young to vote, it was across the age spectrum. They had not voted because they had never seen a candidate that spoke to them or cared about them. And suddenly that's what they saw in Trump. And they didn't care whether he said silly things. Could care less. And even Trump's handlers had a hard time. When the Wiener stories came out with that New York guy, and his handler said to him before, don't mention Wiener. Within 5 minutes, he's talking about Wiener. He was his own person. He said, take me or leave me. You're going to see what you're going to get. And of course, that's what people wanted. So anyway, the other side of it is, the person that's helped me financially a great deal in New York was also funding Trump. He also funded Cruz. The climate advisor to both Trump and Ted Cruz is Roy Spencer. And I think a lot of you know that name. The other name that you need to know, and you'll see more and more of, and I've known him for 30 years. I gave a talk in Congress in the U.S., and he attended a talk afterwards. And that's Myron Ebell, E-B-E-L-L. He is the climate expert and economist at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, and he has already been nominated by Trump to get rid of the EPA and to shut down the climate issues. Because one of the things, and I'll bring this in a bit later on, one of the things that Maurice Strong was a master at was using bureaucrats, using the bureaucracy. And Mary McCarthy, the great American social commentator, said many years ago, bureaucracy is the rule of nobody. It's the modern form of despotism. And it's a very interesting observation about what's going on in our society. So anyway, I've had this human-caused global warming up here long enough. We need to move on to the biggest deception in history. It really is. A lot of people call it a hoax. It is not a hoax. A hoax is something that is done to prick pomposity. So, for example, the Piltdown skull was this one scientist was so full of himself that another scientist said, I'll rig a skull and make it look like it's the missing link, and we'll make a fool out of the guy. There is nothing funny about this deception. With the lives that are lost and the cost in the trillions of dollars that have gone on. And I just want to tell you a little story. I was on an American radio program about a month ago, and a fellow phoned in and said, who's killed more people in history than anyone else? And of course, we're Mao Zedong, Hitler, Stalin, and we're going through the list. And the guy made an interesting comment. He said, they probably never killed anybody themselves. They had other people do their killing for them. And of course, that's the problem with these people. But then he said, the right answer is Rachel Carson. Whoa. Isn't she the founder of the whole environmental movement? Right? Silent Spring? He said, look at what happened. She said that DDT had killed her husband. Her husband died of cancer. And she came out and said it was DDT that killed him. She's the one that went after getting DDT banned. How many people have died in Africa alone because they cannot use the DDT to kill the mosquitoes? 100 million. 100 million, just in Africa. So you see why he made the comment that it was Rachel Carson. And of course, this is the side effect. And one of the things that Bob and I talked about was around the theme that environmentalists are killing environmentalism. Right? They're exploiting it so much, they're crying wolf so often with it, and the public are starting to say, hey, I don't believe anything you tell me anymore. And one of the things I want you to think about, the United Nations did a poll this last year, 8 million people. Climate change was 16th on the list of concerns. And the Pew Center had been doing social concerns of the American public. They list 34 of them. Climate change is number 32. Okay, so you see, and it's interesting because if the public are not interested in it, then why does it remain in the political arena? Why is it? And of course the answer is mostly taxation, the potential to tax. But the other thing is that most politicians are still terrified that somebody's going to come and say, you don't care about the children, you don't care about the planet. Okay, so they put on, and you'll see this term come up in a minute, the cloak of green. Defending the green. So that's some of the ideas about the deception. I wanted to show you this. This is a bit self-serving. This is my grandmother. And it's a picture of her taken in Sydney, Australia in 1888. And it's really, it's a very typical Australian story, this. Because she was orphaned in England, in Bristol, England, at the age of 3. And the closest relatives were in Australia here. So she got shipped out to Australia, of course, traveling with a guardian and so on. And she got to Australia here, loved it here. But then at the age of 18, she's orphaned again. And so the nearest relatives are back in England. She had to go back to England. The sad news is it took 3 months sailing each way, and she got terribly seasick. And it was always a joke. She said, I can't watch a sea movie. I get seasick watching a sea movie. Taught me how to swear. Love her. Love her. Wonderful woman. And by the way, just one interesting little story. She's listening to the radio with my grandfather. Neville Chamberlain comes on and declares war with Germany. She went deaf instantly, never heard another thing. Very interesting. And the doctors say that's the nerve thing. I don't know, but that's what happened. Anyway, I wanted to show you this. We're going to be very eclectic here this evening, by the way. And be aware, I am very conscious that the mind can absorb what the behind can endure. So I'll keep you moving around and hopping. But this is a poem from 1782 by William Cowper. And it is so illustrative. How shall I speak of thee, or thy power address, thou God of our idolatry, the press? By thee, religion and liberty and laws exert their influence and advance their cause. By thee, worse plagues than Pharaoh's land befell, diffused make earth the vestibule of hell. Isn't that what we're hearing from the media today? It's all the world's falling apart. Thou fountain, I love this line, thou fountain at which drink the good and wise, thou ever bubbling spring of endless lies. Isn't that summarized the media today? Said, like Eden's dead probationary tree, knowledge of good and evil is from thee. So that's 1782. Pretty well all the rest of the world's progressed. The media haven't. So evolution doesn't apply to them. I guess that's the story that we can tell from that. But I wanted to put that on there. This is Michael Crichton, Jurassic Park medical doctor, did postdoctoral work at Oxford. He wrote the book State of Fear, which some of you might have read. And the climate science in that book is very, very accurate. Do you know why? Because Michael Crichton shared a room at Harvard with Dick Lindzen, Richard Lindzen. One of those interesting little connections. You're going to come to know that my wife is right when she says I have a whole wealth of useless information. But I've been asked to talk about what I consider the most important challenge facing mankind, and I have a fundamental answer. The greatest challenge facing mankind is the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. Perceiving the truth has always been a challenge to mankind, but in the information age, or as I think of it, the disinform age, it takes on a special urgency and importance. And I was an operations officer flying actively, carrying live weapon loads during the Cuban crisis off the coast of Cuba. So knew very much what was going on there. The scientist who located the missiles on Cuba from satellite and aerial photographs About 2 years ago, before he died, they said to him, would you like to be in the business today? And he said, no. And they said, why not? There's so much things you can do. He said, no, because they can make even photographs, so you can't tell reality. And by the way, I first learned about this. I was on a radio program. The guy says, come into the studio. I want to show you something. Got a new piece of equipment. You punch the button. Here's my voice speaking. And, of course, the computer prints it out. No big deal. Voice recognition, no problem. But then he took individual letters and created new words, and the computer spoke my voice in those new words. If I tell you that there are lawsuits going on right now where a company wants to make songs, Elvis singing songs he never sang in his lifetime, you get an idea of, and by the way, think about that. Remember the Osama bin Laden tapes came out, and it was quite a while before they would confirm, because the electronic signal is his voice. And I'll throw this in here while I'm talking about Osama bin Laden. He said, the West has lost its moral direction. Yeah, he's absolutely right. The West has lost its moral direction. The problem is, I don't want his moral direction either, right? That's the counterpart of it. But in terms of a loss of moral direction, and again, you see that's what the American election was about. Very quickly, society changes its view of things. It learns about things, and it's called a paradigm shift. Academics refer to it as a paradigm shift. Environmentalism was one of these. It was a paradigm shift that was necessary. We needed to be careful and aware. This is the photograph that triggered it. We are very conscious of image and symbols. We're symbolic creatures, okay? And you can see that every way with tattoos and all the rest of the things, and flags, very symbolic things. This picture is actually a composite taken by the astronauts of Apollo 8. But in the school books and all the other things, it was Spaceship Earth, the blue marble. And suddenly we realized just how small our planet was. And what's remarkable about this, from this altitude of 22,000 miles, there is no evidence of humans on the planet whatsoever, including the Great Wall of China. It's another of the myths. And you've got to get down to within about 500 miles before you start to see evidence of us on the planet at all. And it always amuses me, NASA say, yeah, we flew within 100,000 miles of that planet. No life there. Right? But so this was very symbolic in environmentalism. What happens with the new paradigm? It's brought in. Everybody looks at it and says, yay, that sounds like a good idea. There's a small group of people that always grab it because they see the economic and power potential of the idea. And that's what happened with environmentalism. And if you want proof of that, I've been a friend of Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, for a long, long time. And he told me years ago, he said, Tim, when I started out, and within 4 years, the Marxists had taken over. Within 4 years. And he said, I fought it for about 4 more years, and finally I said, I'm not fighting it anymore, and I quit. And by the way, the day after he quit, a whole pile of horse manure appeared on his lawn. And Patrick did what Trump would have done. He called the media in and showed them shoveling it onto his garden and thanking these people for this gift to his garden. And by the way, to prove how Marxist they are, they have now written Patrick out of their history, right? Because that's what leftists do. They rewrite the history and Patrick's gone. One of the things that's always puzzled me in society is what's the role of extremists? Why do we have extremists? What function do they serve? And it's only through looking at these things and studying these things that I realized that the role of extremists is to define the limits for the majority. Because when the environmentalist idea came out, people said, oh, that's a great idea, but how far do we go with that? The same thing with feminism was another paradigm shift. You know, and all the women say, yeah, good idea. Still a lot of things need to be done. But a lot of women were starting to say, well, how far do we go with this? And then suddenly they say, oh, we've got to get rid of the bras. And the women were saying, oh, no, hang on a minute. No, go that extreme. That's happening now with environmentalism. The extremists are going so crazy with it that the public are starting to say, no. And one of my concerns is that we'll lose momentum on environmentalism because of that crying wolf all the time. So anyway, that idea about a paradigm shift, we're coming to the end of the public's awareness of environmentalism, and we'll see some shifts in that. But of course, what happened was that environmentalism has become a religion, right? It's taken all of the dogmatic positions of a religion. And how dare you question the religion? That's certainly true of the young people. And it's interesting because, another little story aside, I was talking to a class one day, and I love to get them on the edge of their seats, I'm going to get that professor. And I said something, and this guy shouted out, "I don't believe you." Well, the class just went, "Whoa." And of course, they could all then see the red sword of pencil of Damocles hanging over his head. I'm going to fail this course for sure. And I let them calm down, and I said, "What don't you believe, Thomas?" And there was a long pause, and he said, "My name isn't Thomas." And I said, "I know that, but how many know in the room what I'm referring to?" In a class of 300, there were 12. And I said, "How many of you ever go to church?" Never. You see, suddenly these sorts of things become, and of course environmentalism came along as a good religion with Gaia, the goddess, and all of the rest of it. And so, because all of us need a moral purpose for living. And so environmentalism provided that. Okay. Thomas Malthus. He was what the sons of aristocrats used to have a pecking order. The first son was going to inherit the estate. The second son went into the army, and the third son became a member of the Church of England, and so on, and worked their way through. And Malthus, of course, became a church minister. And by the way, I've extended that theory because Oliver Cromwell had the misfortune of being in a family in which all the children survived. So by the time they got to him, there was nothing left for him. So he got so mad he took the whole of England. Sorry, is that an obscure historical joke here in the evening? But Malthus, of course, started this idea that the population would outgrow the food supply. It is complete scientific rubbish. And the examples that Malthus used were rubbish. But you know what? Charles Darwin took this book on the Beagle with him. He says in his diaries that Malthus was the major influence on his ideas on the evolutionary theory. And another part of the thing people don't know is that Darwin had a cousin by the name of Galton, Galton, who was the first person to use the word eugenics. Okay, control of population. And so you can see the interlinks in all of this between the discussions that are going on today, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. So Malthus then said the population would outgrow the food supply, and then in the 1960s, a group called the Club of Rome said that the population would outgrow all of the resources, not just the food supply, that we would outgrow all of the resources. And that's when this whole idea of, there's too many people on the planet and they're using too many resources, and the world cannot sustain it. And that's where these phrases came of sustainable development. And I just want to comment on that. Sustainable development to me is the perfect political phrase because it means everything to everyone and nothing to anyone. And I realized that because I'm trying to explain what it is. And then I did a project on sustainable agriculture. That works. Sustainable agriculture works, but sustainable development doesn't. Because development means constant growth. And constant growth in the body is cancer. So you don't want to sustain constant growth and development. But if you turn it around and say we need to develop a sustainable society, now it works. But you see, this is what was going on with Maurice Strong and the Club of Rome and all of these buzzwords and terminologies that were going about at that time. This is Paul Ehrlich, Stanford professor who wrote The Population Bomb, which of course a lot of you might remember, had a huge impact. He couldn't have been more wrong with his predictions if he tried. According to him, Britain shouldn't even exist today. He said Britain would be gone by the year 2000. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. And of course, I like to say he produced the first hockey stick here. a fellow by the name of Julian Simon said to Ehrlich, I'll bet you that you can pick any minerals you want, any time period you want, and that at the end of the time period there will be more minerals available than there is today. And Ehrlich took the bet. And Simon asked and said to Ehrlich, okay, let's do it. Here's the person that Ehrlich got to pick out the minerals and the length of time that they would, of the bet. His name's John Holdren. He is the science czar in the Obama White House. Okay? So he picked the minerals that Ehrlich refused to pay the bet, by the way. They eventually publicly shamed him into it, in that book that I showed you. But Ehrlich is a eugenicist. He wants to get rid of people. There are too many people on the planet, and people of the wrong type. And yet he's sitting right in Obama's White House as the science czar. He's the guy that came up with the term polar vortex, which is just absolute nonsense. I mean, we've always known about cold Arctic air outbreaks. Never called it a vortex. It was the circumpolar vortex. But he was in the White House coming up with all these terms and people catching on. And of course implying that somehow things were worse than they were. Here's a quote from his book, that 1977 book. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger society. Now, I want to go through that with you, because this shows you leftist thinking. This shows you the extreme control thinking. Because notice it says, it has been concluded. Who concluded it? They did, right? So they set up the straw man. And then he says, compulsory abortion could be sustained if the population crisis became sufficiently severe. Who decides when it's severe? They do. So they're controlling the supply and the demand. What a wonderful job, right? Every company wants a monopoly as long as they've got it, right? That's what it is. I'll show you this kind of thinking a little bit later on when we get to the climate issue and Agenda 21. Of course, they were the ones that first used computer models for projecting into the future, and that's our problem with the climate, is the computer models don't work. Limits to growth was, they said, we've got this much resource, we're using it at this rate, and if we continue at that, we'll run out of the resource by such and such a year. According to them, we should have run out of oil by now, we should have run out of water, we should have virtually everything. Okay, it was simple linear trend projections, an absolute nonsense. But and by the way, that's where the word peak oil came from, okay? That there's a peak to the thing. And I don't want to scare you, but they're now talking about peak water, because water is going to be the next issue after the climate issue starts to fail. So, because these guys don't give up. The world's not overpopulated at all. The light purple is the less than 50 population per square mile. On a search out of northern Canada up here, and had an American, we were looking for his brother, and he came up the cockpit halfway at noon, and he started screaming at us and said, I know the governor of California, going to have you all fired from the Air Force. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're just flying around in circles. I said, sir, we covered 10,000 square miles this morning. He said, I never saw anything. I said, welcome to Canada. Right? And you know what? And as he got off the plane, he never said anything. He went in the back and sat looking out the window. As he got off the plane, he said, I'll never believe in overpopulation again. That was his only comment. But yes, there's concentrations of population, but the world is not overpopulated by any stretch of the imagination. But of course, that's the fear. But here's the ironic thing. This is called the demographic transition. Because you see, what they're opposed to is fossil fuel, CO2, and development, industry and development. But if you have development, then the population declines naturally. Okay? It's called the democratic. We've known this since 1943. It's been in the literature. And what you don't hear in the world is those countries that are not allowing migrants in and have development, their population's dying. The average replacement rate is 2.6 children per family. And I have a fear that I'm the 0.6 in my family. But sorry. At 2.6 children, Japan's got 1.3. They're not even replaced. And Japan is one of the most racist countries on earth. They don't allow anybody in. Aoki, the golfer, is a Korean. He's been there for 3 generations. They won't give him citizenship. So when you start to look at what, and by the way, I played golf with a Japanese guy. His parents were in Manchuria when he was born, so it says Manchuria on his certificate. He's down the scale in Japan, even today. It is really remarkable. And many countries are paying families to have more children. Italy's paying for a 3rd and 4th child. Quebec is paying for Quebecers to have a 3rd and 4th child. The problem in Quebec is they're only paying the French Canadians to have children. So in other words, if you have development, you solve the problem of overpopulation. Okay, 1994, this is the Club of Rome, the treaty, in searching for a new enemy to unite us. See, that's what you need. An outside threat, a threat to the whole world, something to unite us. We came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, you can see it there, the threat of global warming became one. Because you see, what they needed was something to transcend national boundaries. Because they knew there were nations that would say, go away, leave us alone. And so they wanted something, and therefore you brought the United Nations into the whole thing. And the water shortages I mentioned. It's sad to say this is the Canadian Maurice Strong. And in a book, and I'll show you the book in a minute, he was interviewed by Elaine Dewar. She was an investigative journalist of the proper type. She wanted to write a book praising all of the Canadian environmentalists, like Suzuki and Elizabeth May and Maurice Strong. The more research she did, the more she discovered these people were more corrupt than the environment or the business people they were attacking. Okay, that they had their own personal political agendas. And so she wrote the book Cloak of Green, which I'll show you in a minute. In an interview, this is what he told her. Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized nations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? She said to him, well, then why don't you run for politics? And probably the only honest thing he ever said in his life was, you can't do anything as a politician. He said, I'm going to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. And that's exactly what he did. And by the way, he died recently. And they always say, don't speak ill of the dead. In this case, I'll make an exception. But he died in China because the American government wanted to put him in jail because he and his son, and Kofi Annan and his son, made millions off the oil for food crisis in Iraq. You remember when they said that Saddam Hussein could sell oil to feed the children? That money went into their bank accounts. I've got a photograph on my computer of a check made out to Maurice Strong for $980,000 being held by a South Korean banker. So when you start to look at what was going on, but I want you to think about this, because one of the things about some of these people is it's one thing to have an idea, it's another thing to implement it. You know, I'm sure everybody in this room has thought of an idea for business or for something, but putting it into practice is another whole different story. How would you do this? Well, if you think about the industrialized nation as a car, same idea, running on fossil fuels, right? How do you stop the car? You can squeeze the fuel line, the car will stop. But if you did that with a nation, cut off their fuel supply, the people would get very angry very quickly, okay? But you can also stop the engine of a car by plugging the exhaust. And so if you could show that the exhaust from the car, the CO2, was causing runaway global warming, then you could convince people, hey, we've got to shut down those industrialized nations. That's why CO2 got chosen. You can say to people, why did they pick CO2? And all the gases they could have chosen. Why CO2? That's the reason. That's the reason. Okay? Now, this is the evil genius of Maurice Strong. And by the way, there's the book Cloak of Green. This is the guy in the Amazon rainforest who conned them all, including that stupid singer Sting. and con them all into giving his tribe millions of dollars. And he's just laughing at them. He later disclosed that they were all fools. So Elaine put it. But here's what she said. Her conclusion after 5 days was Strong. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. That's what was going on. And of course, that's the background behind what you and I have been talking about. Now, Strong, as I said, was, and I've talked to people that went to school with him, grew up with him, and all about him. And this is the framework that he set up. So he had Strong, he set up the United Nations Environment Program. He organized the Rio Conference in 1992. And then he had the political side through Agenda 21, which is now Agenda 2030. And then the Conference of the Parties. Now, the Conference of the Parties is the political group that meet every year. They're in some weird place right now, isn't it? Yeah, Morocco, that's what it is. Yeah, and that's the king that gave Hillary $12 million, wasn't it? Yeah. Oh, they're all in it together. So the Conference of the Parties. The most important Conference of the Parties was 15. That was Copenhagen, when suddenly the Kyoto died because the emails were leaked. Why were the leaked emails important? Because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they come up with the science that these people can make their policy decisions on. Okay? So the scientific control. Strong knew, and he did it through the World Meteorological Organization, and Senator Roberts and I talked about this a great deal, because the World Meteorological Organization is made up of the national weather offices of every country in the world. And Strong knew if you got the bureaucrats in it, they would then convince the politicians, and he had total control. So that's what's been going on. Okay? So there we see the organizational structure. And here's the other thing. And I'll just very quickly step aside with an idea. I used to think commissions of inquiry were wonderful things. In fact, when I was coming into town today, there was a group out there saying, we're demanding a royal commission to investigate. You know, the group out there on the streets. And I thought they were great. You say, oh, finally, get the politics out of the issue. You get the politics into the issue more when you get a commission of inquiry. And I know that because I've served on many of them. And the very first one I was assigned to was conflict over a very large lake in Canada. And the minister said, would you serve? And I said, yeah, I thought it was great. Commissions of inquiry, those are good. Then we got the terms of reference. The terms of reference were so narrow that they predetermined the outcome. And I said to the chairman, Doug Duncan, I said, you go tell the minister, either we get complete access to everything, or I'm going to go to the media and say the minister's trying to predetermine the outcome. I guess he decided that was a bigger political threat. And we got all the information. And what did we find? There had been 4 previous commissions. All the suggestions to solve the problems have been there, and none of the politicians had ever done anything about any of them. One of them going back over 100 years. And of course, it's in those terms of reference that you control. So here's what Strong did, the definition of climate change. A change of climate attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere. But there's the problem. The problem is you cannot determine human effect unless you know the amount and cause of natural change. Right? So he knew that. Exactly. Sorry? Exactly. Yeah, right there. But this is all done deliberately. And the public think that the IPCC are looking at total climate change. They have no idea of this limitation on it. Even the media are stunned when you tell them this. So you can see how he controlled it. And so many stories I want to tell you. But I was watching Judge Warren. You remember the Kennedy Commission shot Kennedy? And they were interviewing him. And they said, well, Judge Warren, why didn't you look at Jack Ruby and the mafia connection in Dallas? He said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. And what's the biggest conspiracy theory today? The Jack Kennedy shooting. And of course, he got the word to not talk about that. I knew what he was saying, but I knew most of the people watching it didn't have a clue. Okay, here's another thing that they use all the time, precautionary principle. This is Agenda 21, Principle 15. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. That, of course, allows them then to pick and choose who's got to pay. The rich will pay, the poor will benefit, right? So you have to understand how to interpret this. It says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage. Who decides that? They do, okay? Lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used. Don't bring me those facts. I just know there's a problem. Trust me. So you completely diverted away from any potential fact or evidence. And of course, this is what Malcolm Robertson is doing with the empirical evidence in CSIRO. So you see, that's the parallels between that and what I showed you about John Holdren and the compulsory abortion. The same idea. They set up the problem, they determine when it's a problem, and they then are allowed to act on it. So it's a complete control. Okay, I'll go through this very quickly. A lot of you know that the hypothesis is the way science works. A scientist hypothesizes. The hypothesis is only as good as the assumptions, and they assume that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and that a CO2 increase would cause a temperature increase. The only place in the world where that occurs is in the computer models of the IPCC. In every other record that we've got, the temperature increases before the CO2. In other words, their fundamental assumption is wrong. And that's how you attack a hypothesis. You attack the assumptions. And here's the ice core graph for Antarctica. And I remember when Pettit and Jousel and the French team brought this out at the press conference, and I watched it. And Jousel, who was the second scientist involved, and he kept saying, don't rush to judgment on this. He said, look, this is a 10-centimeter graph on an 8.5 by 11 page, and it's 420,000 years long, and not only that, but there's a 70-year smoothing applied to it. So you smooth out all of the variability, which is, what, of course, what tells you what's actually going on. So they've eliminated all of the evidence. But within 5 years of this being published, Fisher and all were showing that the temperature was changing before the CO2, not as had been, but they just swept right through that as they do today. This is a complex systems diagram, and I wanted to show you it because when you're standing outside, the weather you experience is made up of thousands of different variables changing all the time. It's a very complex system. And yet, out of all of this, they've essentially only picked one small gas, one small part of it. It's kind of like saying that they're going to do, some doctor's going to do a complete thorough physical of Tim Ball, and he decides, well, I'll save a lot of time and money. I'll just look at that one brown ward on his left arm. And then he'll conclude that Tim Ball is small and brown and prone to cancer. That'll be the conclusion. That's what they're doing here. Of course, the computer models, useless. 85% of the world, we've got no data. 70% oceans, 20% of the forest, no data. 90% deserts. Here's the big one that's missed in Australia. This is a big issue. Grasslands, a major, major factor, and they're not even included in most of the calculations. 20% mountains. So what have you built your model on? And the answer is nothing. And a lot of people don't know this. When they don't have data, they make it up. They make it up. In fact, we're now at the point where they've got one computer model creating data, which they then use as real data in another computer model. It's just absolute madness. And then they said, well, we haven't got enough data, so we'll assume, we've got one set of a station here with data, we'll assume that applies to a 1,200 kilometer radius around. So if you look at this one, for example, here's James Bay, which is subarctic, and here's North Carolina, which is subtropical, and they're telling you that all the same temperature and climate applies. I mean, grade 10 would fail, and that's an insult to grade 10s. So you can see why we're so concerned about what's going on. These are the variables that they say that they're looking at, 11 of them, 11 variables. Those are the human causes of climate change, which they're limited to. Notice that they've got a LOSU, this is level of scientific understanding. Only 2 of them are high. All the rest are moderate or low. So even in the 11 that they've chosen, they don't know much. Incredible. This is like taking 11 pieces of a jigsaw, a 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and saying, I've solved the puzzle with 11 pieces. That's effectively what they've done here. So when you start to look, and I'll just show you that hasn't changed, because here's the same graph from the AR5, the most recent IPCC report, and here you see the level of confidence. They changed it from scientific understanding to confidence, and they've altered some of the ratings, but it really is the same rubbish. I'll just go through very quickly. This is the total atmosphere of the Earth. Here's the greenhouse gases, or what they designate. Here is the greenhouse gases expanded. This is the CO2, natural CO2, and that's the human portion of CO2. And they're telling you that that is affecting the global temperature and global climate since 1950. The sole cause of all climate change since 1950. I wish I could get away with these things. I wish I could. And I won't expand on it much longer, but this is the CO2 at 4%, water vapor at 95%. Water vapor is the most important greenhouse by far. In fact, if you vary water vapor by 1%, it eliminates all of the variability caused by CO2. But see, what they said was, oh yeah, humans produce, they don't look at water vapor. Do you know why? They said, yeah, well, humans produce a little bit, but it's so small amount compared to the total amount, we'll just ignore it. That's how they wrote off 95% of the greenhouse effect. Amazing. If your predictions are wrong, your science is wrong. End of story. Here's their predictions. Starting in 1990, here's their predictions. And look what's actually happening. And yet they've still got credibility. It is absolutely amazing that this is going on. This is John Christie's presentation from his congressional. John's going to appear at my trial. I'll just show this very quickly. They move the goalposts. They don't go back and look at the science. They move the goalposts. So up to 1998, global temperature was rising. They called it global warming. But then what happened after this was the global temperature started to level off, but the CO2 kept going up. That's what Thomas Huxley said 100 years ago was the great tragedy of science. A beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. So what did they do? They stopped calling it global warming. They started calling it climate change. And I remember when this happened because I was saying, look, you're calling me a global warming skeptic, but all scientists are skeptics. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. So tell me something I don't know. And I remember the day that my name appeared on the front page of the Times of London. And I always feel bad when I say it, because I remember my mother saying that, she said, I hate name droppers. I was just telling the Queen last week. And of course, then they had to up the ante because now you became a climate change denier with all the Holocaust connotations of that. That was deliberate, okay? And they knew it was done deliberately. Sorry, it's at the bottom of the screen. I'll read it out for you. But these are from the leaked emails at East Anglia, 2004. And a fellow from the Minns Tyndall Center, I've forgotten his name, doesn't matter. In my experience, global warming freezing is already a bit of a public relations problem with the media. Remember you had those cold winters in North America? And people were saying, well, where's the global warming? I made a joke out of it. I told people that global warming is another undelivered government promise. Okay? But Bo Yellen, who's the Swedish climate representative, he wrote, he said, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. This is done deliberately. What they should have done was say, what's wrong with our science? But they didn't do that. They absolutely didn't do that. Okay, David Deming, who I've known for about 35 years, I published an article in Science in 1995, What to Do About the Medieval Warm Period. With the publication of the article in Science in 1995, I gained significant credibility in the community of scientists working on climate change. They thought I was one of them, someone who would pervert science in the service of social and political causes. That was what was going on. And so one of them let his guard down. It was Jonathan Overpeck, who was at the East Anglia. And he says, a major person working in the area of climate change and global warming sent me an email, astonishing email that said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. We got to rewrite that history. Right? And of course, that's what triggered Michael Mann and his hockey stick. And here you see the graph that Hubert Lamb produced and here you see the warm period and the little ice age and then the warming. That was the graph that troubled them. Because the 1990 report wasn't bad. It was the 1995 where the politics of this really got going. And of course, here's Michael Mann's hockey stick. And by the way, just to show you how bad this was, this is a tree ring record, and tree rings are about precipitation, not temperature. Okay, and I know that. I've done a lot of tree ring studies. And then they grafted onto it an instrumental record, which is scientific rubbish. You can't take two different forms of data and blend them together like this. This warming here was produced by Phil Jones at East Anglia. And he said the global temperature went up 0.6 degrees Celsius in 110 years. But what didn't get reported, although it is in the report, he said it's plus or minus 0.2. So in other words, it went up 0.6, but the error factor is plus or minus 33%. Right? Even Hillary Clinton wouldn't fix the polls that badly. Right? I mean, it's just absolutely astonishing. And yet here it is, the blade of the hockey stick. Michael Mann's claim of academic exemption from freedom of information. And this is, by the way, I'll tell you very quickly, I'll do this. But I was at a conference in Bismarck, North Dakota about 30 years ago, and Avril Harriman, who was the first UN representative at the UN, or US representative at the UN, made a wonderful speech. And this, I think you'll find very informative about what's going on in the world today. But he did it with a pen, and he said, okay, if I sell you this pen, you have the pen, I no longer have the pen. It's a complete transferal of property. But if I sell you an idea, you have the idea, but I've still got the idea. And he said, what you're going to see over the next 60 years or more is the problem with copyright, freedom of information, but proprietary nature of data. That's what's going on in the world. How do you have an idea and keep all of the profit that it can give you without somebody else benefiting? The Trans-Pacific Partnership Plan that Trump is saying he's going to scrap, 30% of that is devoted to dealing with this particular problem, because the Chinese will steal anything. And so, anyway, that's an interesting sidelight of what's going on in the world. But, of course, Mark Stein wrote the book, A Disgrace to the Profession. And I told my lawyer, I said, I'll buy 12 copies for the jurors. That's all they need to read. That's all they need to read.
Where's that case up to at the moment?
Sorry?
Where's that case up to at the moment? Stein versus a man.
Oh, my case?
No, Stein.
Oh, the Stein case. No, what happened in Mann sued Stein. Stein immediately countersued. And they said, well, you know, how much are you countersuing for? He said, oh, $29 million. Threw it out there. That is the genius of the U.S. founding fathers. And I know Australia took a lot of their ideas in their formation. Because the American founding fathers knew that if you could sue somebody, you could cause all kinds of trouble. So they said, they built in a constitutional tort that says if you're sued, you can immediately countersue. I couldn't do that in Canada. All I can do is accept the lawsuit and then at some point go to the judge and say, I want the case dismissed. But you know what? I have to wait 10 years to do that. So now what Mann has done with the countersuit by Mark Stein is he's gone to the courts and asked the courts to rule if this is a slap lawsuit. Remember I talked about a slap lawsuit? And here's Mann, the great slap lawsuit applier, using it in his defense against Mark Stein. I mean, Stein loves this stuff. I mean, it's absolutely bar. But they've been waiting 4 years now. They've been waiting 4 years. And I had dinner with Mark about 7 months ago, and he said he doesn't see that it moving at all. In fact, he believes that Mann's going to pull out of my case as well, that he tries to avoid things at the end. I'll just show this very quickly. This is the current temperature here. This is the Little Ice Age. Here's the medieval warm period. This is what they call the Holocene optimum. Notice that for the last 10,000 years, the world's been warmer than today 97% of the time. And yet the public are told this is as warm as it's ever been. And just to satisfy Malcolm Roberts, I've got some empirical evidence. Okay? Because here, is a white spruce, Picea glauca, growing 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. For a tree of that dimension to be growing at that latitude, the global temperature had to be at least 3 degrees Celsius warmer than today. And I'm not going to pursue this too far, just to show you the radiocarbon dating on that tree. And this is from Professor Ritchie at the University of Toronto. It's 5,000 years old. And look at the temperature at the time that tree was growing. I'll make you think about another idea here. The polar bears lived through all of that, right? The polar bears lived through all of this, okay? And I can tell you, polar bears are superb swimmers. Flying search and rescue in the Arctic, I've seen polar bears 200 miles offshore. You know why they're good swimmers? Because their bit longer fur is hollow. It floats, and they just paddle away. Anyway, so there's the empirical evidence, and you can see that there's that sort of stuff all around. I'll just show this very quickly. This is Australia's mega droughts going back to 1,000 years. You can see the droughts. There were many more in the medieval warm period, and but notice that the pretty level, some variability of it. But drought is not abnormal here, and yet they're trying to tell you it's bad. It's going to get worse. This is the long-term aridity changes in the west of the United States. And you can see it's actually getting drier. And here's the winter-spring rainfall in Australia from 1900 to 2014. I mean, where's the panic? Where's the panic? And you can do this with all of these records. It's just simply really no significant change going on. This is the number of severe storms, tropical storms. And here's the tornadoes in the United States. Look how many there were here back in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, the worst year for tornadoes in the United States was 1905. 250 people died in that year from tornadoes in the United States. And there weren't many people living in Tornado Alley at that time. So every one of these records shows you that all these claims about more severe is not true. Yale University did a grade 10 study amongst the American public, like a high school test. This is the results. 77% got D or F. Okay? I think these were some of my old students. No. But it was incredible. And they were, for you and I, were pretty simple questions about CO2 and oxygen and water vapor and all this stuff. The public don't understand, don't know. And by the way, they're not ashamed of it. They should say, hey, I got more important things in my life. It's not of concern to me. And so you see those results. And then we got the argument that 97% of scientists agree, the consensus argument. And I think you all know that this was doctored in Queensland at the university there. Cook were the scientist. Of the 11,000 papers they looked at, it was only 41 that actually met their own criteria. So the proper number was 0.37%. But Barack Obama was wandering around saying 97% of scientists agree. The best way to use this number is 97% of scientists have never ever looked at the IPCC reports. Okay? That's the truth of it. And if they did, this is what they would find. This is a German meteorologist, physicist, Klaus Eckhart Pulse. Look what he says here. 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day I started checking the facts and data. First I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without checking the facts. That's the reality, okay? So, and I had the privilege of being invited to a breakfast table by Harrison Schmitt, the US astronaut, the only scientist that ever went to the moon, the last astronaut to leave the moon, and he invited me because he had a whole bunch of other NASA people there, and he wanted them to ask me questions. They could not believe what they were finding. And Harrison Schmitt, of course, has become also a science advisor to Donald Trump. So there's a lot of input of things there. We're getting close to what you can endure, aren't you? Yes, I know.
No, it's going well. Keep on going.
We're okay. By eliminating natural causes, of course, they left out the sun, the Milankovitch effect, and this is the changes in the orbit and changes in tilt, and I'll link them up here.
So they're putting those in the models?
Well, they're not in the models.
Right.
This is not in the models at all. And they say, oh, well, because the time scale is blue. Shall I tell you how recent this stuff is? I remember in the 1970s and 80s going to conferences, anybody mentioned Milankovitch, they got hooted right out of the hall. And I remember a conference in Ottawa in 1989, somebody mentioned Milankovitch, nobody questioned it. That's that recent that the Milankovitch effect has been around. But, yes?
Aren't we due to actually start to have our temperatures decline because of this? Is it predicted that the changing our orbit axis is going to slowly cause the temperatures to decline by a degree or so? Around now, sometime it's supposed to start. We're actually
Okay.
going to go through one of the cycles with the Milankovitch, which is supposed to cause us to receive less energy from the sun and bring our temperatures down slowly.
Yeah, okay, well, let me go through it. The changing orbit here is caused by the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter. Okay, it explains about 98% of it. And it goes from almost circular it is now to extreme ellipse. And you can see the long-term variation in the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth. And then you've got the changing tilt of the axis here. And it goes from a minimum of 21.8 to 20 plus 24.4. And you can see that very steady thing. And then you've got the precession of the equinox. If we don't keep changing our calendars, they get out of date with what's going on in the solar system. And I was teaching a courses at the Stony Mountain Penitentiary. And I went there because I wanted to have a captive audience for a change. And because of this, in 1782, the government changed the calendar by 11 days. And everybody rioted. And when I said this, one of the prisoners said, I know people that weren't upset. The year got shortened by 11 days. It's all a matter of where you're sitting, right? But you can see here, this is where we are now. I don't know if that answers your question, but... Yeah. Well, this shows we should be going down, but more importantly, the sun's activity shows we're cooling. That's the critical thing. And I'll just show you that very quickly here. We knew for years that there was a relationship between sunspot numbers and global temperature. More sunspots, warmer temperatures, less sunspots, cooler. But we didn't know the mechanism. And then Svensmark came out with this in 1996, where he showed the cosmic radiation coming through creates low cloud in the atmosphere, and as the cloud cover changes, that of course affects global temperature. So the amount of cosmic ray reaching the Earth is controlled by the sun's magnetic field. So the sunspots are simply a manifestation of the variation in the sun's magnetic field. Yeah. Yeah. The clouds, you know that, the clouds are very important in daily temperatures and everything else. And here you can see the low cloud cover in the blue and plotted against the cosmic radiation coming from space. And the correlation is so high. So that's, but none of this is in the science, in the IPCC report. They don't even talk about any of it. They don't even mention it. So, okay, I'm going a bit long, am I? Yeah, I'll just show you. This is London in 1683, the great frost on the Thames River, Jan Griffier's painting. You can see St. Paul's Cathedral in the background there. You can see Westminster Abbey, Lambeth Palace here. And you can see ice fairs. Queen Elizabeth I skated on the Thames quite regularly. And the last time they had enough ice for an ice fair was 1836. And some wag has said that the ice doesn't form anymore because they built the Houses of Parliament here and the hot air from the politicians is causing it. But you can see the relationship. This is where we are now. The sun's cooling down, number of sunspots actually at a minimum. Yuzovskin, the Russian, and other scientists are saying we're going to be cooling for at least 40 years. And of course, the government are preparing for warming. That's the tragedy of all of this. I'll finish up with one of my heroes. This is Václav Klaus, the Czech Republic president. The only world leader who dared to speak out against any of this. And of course, 2 years in office, and they brought all sorts of lawsuits against him because of what he was saying. At the conference in New York, the first Heartland Conference of Climate, his comment was, we've lived through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that? Okay, and the place just erupted. Okay? And he wrote a book, which I think's got a wonderful. Oh, sorry. He wrote a book, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. Isn't that a lovely term? Blue Planet in Green Shackles. What is endangered, climate or freedom? And of course, this is the theme that Malcolm Roberts has been pushing. And then I'll leave you with this is the first book I bought, The Direct Corruption of Climate Science. I just, about a month ago, bought out a much shorter version. And this is done in the way that a proper investigative journalism, the why, what, where, when, and how, so that it's just a little pocket book. People can pick it up and see what they did, how they did it, why they did it, and say, okay, now you know. And this doesn't have any references in it, but this one has a whole pile. So that's where we are. I thank you so much for your attention this evening. Give you that overview of the whole thing.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. I don't know that we've got much time for questions.
I did that deliberately. Yeah.
Make it, stretch it.
Yeah. I think we may run out of time in the hall. Okay, we'll take a couple of quick questions, and if anybody's got points, but not speeches, but questions.
What's the end game of all of this, of the people running that show?
Well, the end game of it now will change with Trump.
Yeah, but apart from Trump, because he's going to change everything, but if Trump wasn't there, what's their goal?
Oh, the goal was in Strong's comment of world government, global governance. Oh yeah. Well, of course, the carbon tax and the plan at Copenhagen was they were going to introduce a carbon tax, global carbon tax, and the IMF was going to collect the tax and distribute it. So yeah, that was the whole plan. Totally. Yeah.
One final one to there.
I enjoyed what you had to say. One of the things that I find disturbing is the inability of the media to hear any of this. How do you get through? Like, people will refuse to listen to you.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got this problem that the general population aren't interested in it anyway. How do you get the media to listen?
There is the third stage of the American Revolution going on right now. The American Revolution was, in fact, the British people's revolution because all the people that led the American Revolution had come from Britain. Benjamin Franklin, all of these people. They instituted the first two phases of it. The first one was free speech. America was the first country and only country in the world where free speech is the #1 issue. And then they knew how important and how attacked it would be because they then brought in the Second Amendment, which was guns to defend the first free speech amendment. Okay, and a lot of people don't realize the Second Amendment is that citizens can have guns to stop their own government taking over. Okay, that's what it's about. The people think, oh, it's Americans, they're crazy guns. No, it was done. And in fact, Jefferson didn't think their government would last more than 20 years. The second important part of the American Revolution was for the first time in history, and I know Australians appreciate this, private ownership of land. You're seeing private ownership of land under threat here in Australia. I know, we're seeing it in Canada. Okay, the lawyers talk about Magna Carta and all that rubbish at Runnymede. Nothing to do with private ownership of land. In fact, the only thing that I found amusing about Magna Carta and Runnymede was the American tourist was at Runnymede, and he said, well, when was this thing signed anyway? And the guide said 1216, and the American said, shit, missed it by 20 minutes. But but the third phase, and by the way, what happened at Magna Carta was simply Prince Charles telling the Queen he didn't like the way she was doing things. The serfs were still serfs back on the territory. It was only when they got to America that they could privately own land. And that's an important part. But the third part of the American Revolution is underway right now. One of the things that allowed Trump to win was social media. The internet is control and access to information. And control of information is absolutely essential. Because you know when there's a coup, the first thing they do is take the radio, TV stations. And so the internet, the social media, is the final stage of the American Revolution. And I think you saw it going on. And you'll hear the journalists say, oh, those bloggers, they don't know anything. Oh, yeah, like you know a lot more. And it's incredible how many of the young people get their information through Facebook and Twitter. And you can say, yeah, it's a massive information, but they sort it all out. They get the whole range of it, and they can decide for themselves.
Last one, this one, because we've got problems with the accommodation.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I just got a question about the Canadian connection. I just wondered if you pushed the Morris Strong thing too hard. And there's some people in this room actually who are involved actually in that transition from the old definition of climate change to the new one under the FCC. And it was quite interesting what happened there. I'm not sure how much Morris Strong's involved. But at that time, there was a lot of other Canadian involvement from the Toronto conference in '88, and then you had Jim Bruce at Billick, and you had McNeil, and you had various other people involved around that time. Now, some people have connected that with Canada wanting to sell its nuclear and hydro to the US. And I wonder if you could just comment a bit about what was going on in Canada around '88, early '90s.
Well, what was going on in Canada was a dispute over resources. Because just like Australia, Canada is a resource economy. And Eastern Canada wanted to control the resources, and Alberta, of course, wanted to develop and make the money off their own resources. And they were threatening taxes and so on. And in fact, there was bumper stickers in Alberta that said, let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark. You know, they really were not interested in it. So that was all around the control of the resources. But there was something else I was going to say. But that really was the issue. Because in Canada, the resources belong to the provinces under our Constitution. Okay? And so the feds have tried to control it by environmental controls and all of these other ways of controlling it. And it was a bit like the provinces were saying, well, you know, my son says, can I have the car? And I say, yes, you can, but you can't have the keys. You know, there was that kind of politicking going on in Canada at that time. I've long been a promoter of Western separatism. I think we should cut the country in half because the two halves of the country are so markedly different. But it was about the resources. And you're going to see that around the world. The control of the resources is the real thing.
Just one final question before we get too much into Canadian politics. One quick one, is this?
I'd like you to address this statement. Damn your facts and figures and your science. Global warming has to be true because it justifies socialism.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
That was his speech.
Yeah, that's the whole, you should have spoken. People could have been out of here earlier.
Look, I think we've got to wrap it up now because we are running somewhat over time. I'd like John Spooner to offer a few final comments on this. John was a collaborator in the last book with Bob, and a very important collaborator. In fact, probably made the book by his acerbic cartoons, etc.
Ann Carter rang me the other night and said that, John, you've got to be there on behalf of the family. Jeremy was here, but he had to shoot through, I'm sorry to say. She wanted to thank you. She's really thrilled at the whole idea of a Bob Carter Memorial Lecture. Listening to you reminded me that, I only knew Bob for about 7 years. I became a great friend of Bob's. And we used to talk about a lot of things. One of them was Cicero. Yeah. And listening to you tonight, it was such a vivid example of how you can get someone who, you've read their words, then you see them talk, and it's just so vivid. And Bob was like that too. Yeah. It's why he would have been a great teacher. I'm sure he was a great teacher. And why people were afraid to debate him. I actually remember he was approached once by the editor of a national magazine. Said, we're going to do a conference on climate change. And would you like to be in? He said, sure, I'll go in. He rang back about a week later and said, look, the other side have found out that you're going to be talking, and I'm afraid we don't want you to come. And he went ahead with the conference without Bob running the other side. And I thought, well, in that context, I was continuously energised by Bob's courage and his total inability to give up at any moment in the whole struggle. And it was a struggle for truth. And tonight you just exemplified that, Tim, and we want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm sure you can buttonhole Tim and others and chat about some particular aspects you have. But it was a great tour de force, Tim, in terms of the whole bunch led by the very own deplorables, Maurice Strong, Paul Ehrlich, and John Holdren. And we thank you very much for enlightening us on this, the first Bob Carter Memorial Lecture. Thank you.